Hello, welcome to the Minneapolis Institute of Arts. My name is Rachel McGarry, and I'm a curator in the Prints and Drawings department. And with Bob Jacobson, our esteemed curator emeritus of Asian art, I had the great pleasure of organizing the exhibition here featuring Ricci's recently discovered and extraordinary map of the world. And it is wonderful to see such a great turnout for a lecture on Matteo Ricci. It's sold out today. The enthusiastic associates of the James Ford Bell Library and the terrific staff of the University of Minnesota Libraries, our co-sponsors for the event, have done such a wonderful job getting the word out about this lecture, and we thank you for that. I've often laughed imagining what Father Ricci would think about Minneapolis becoming home to one of the rare preserved copies of his 400-year-old Chinese map. Our city would certainly have seemed far-flung and exotic to the Italian-born Jesuit working in China. In his map, which dates from the year 1602, Ricci charted the American continents with impressive accuracy. Yet the lands in North America remained very murky in the dawn of the 17th century. Remember, the Jamestown settlement was only founded in 1607, and the Mayflower set sail in 1620. The middle west of Ricci's North America is not a vast stretch of fertile farmland and prairie, but rather is adorned with an impressive and very desirable, in my mind, mountain range. And in the general vicinity of Minnesota and Canada, Ricci wrote on the map, "No one has gone north to this place, so that nothing is yet known about its inhabitants or products." Thankfully, times have changed. Minneapolis-St. Paul has developed not only into a vibrant economic center, but an important cultural and artistic capital, a significant center of learning. The thriving museums, universities, libraries, and colleges owe their existence in large part to a number of exceptional Minnesota families and individuals who have shown extraordinary generosity, leadership, and foresight generation after generation in creating and sustaining great civic institutions. The arrival of the Ricci map in Minneapolis highlights the magnanimity of one exceptional leader in this arena, Dr. Ford Bell. Ford Bell comes from a long line of generous patrons, as we all know. The Bell family has enriched the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and the University of Minnesota immeasurably. The James Ford Bell Library at the University of Minnesota, with its superb collection of rare books and early maps, is a gem in our city. While Dr. Bell's home may be in Washington, D.C., where he serves as president of the American Association of Museums, he remains dedicated to Minnesota, deeply supporting a number of institutions here that fall into his wide array of interests: the arts, public education, rare books, natural history, veterinary medicine, in which he has a doctorate degree in, to name just a few of his pursuits. With the significant acquisition of the Ricci map through the James Ford Bell Trust, Dr. Bell sets the bar very high in our community. This monument in cartography will attract scholars and graduate students to the University of Minnesota, stimulate new and original research, raise new questions about the age of exploration, the dawn of globalization, and the cultural, religious, and intellectual exchange between East and West. Diane Nyman's role as a trustee of the James Ford Bell Trust must also be noted. Her wise stewardship, intellectual curiosity, charming personality, and coveted Rolodex ushered the journey of the map from London to Washington to Minnesota. And finally, there's Daniel Crouch, our speaker this afternoon, who is another important protagonist in the story of this map. Discovering it on the Asian art market, the impossible black tulip, as it is popularly called, recognizing its significance and rarity. Daniel Crouch likes to brag that he's in the fortunate position of being paid for something he loves, and his passion for his work will be evident today. He has worked as a bookseller since the age of 16, first as a Saturday boy at Sanders of Oxford, while in school and at university, and subsequently becoming the general manager in 1998. In 1999, he was asked to work at Bonham's Auction House as a business developer. And in 2002, he was invited to Bernard Shapiro to start the Map and Atlas department, where he has been ever since. Daniel still lives in Oxford, the town in which he was born, with his wife Jen and two daughters, Sophie 4 and Lucy 2. Please give a warm welcome to Daniel Crouch.
Good afternoon. It's customary at such events for the organizers or the speaker to make an appeal early on for people to turn off BlackBerries and iPhones and keep your phones to a minimum. I want to make a small exception for that today because I'm sure you're aware my home nation is playing a football tournament against one of our uppity former colonies. And if you'd like to shout out the score at any time, heckling is encouraged. Anyway. My love affair with this map, and this map and I first met nearly 20 years ago when I was a schoolboy and visited the Royal Geographic Society in London, where on the wall a slightly later version of the map hangs. Now, having had an education in England, I knew that England was the centre of the universe and that time started at Greenwich. And so, and having seen sort of 19th century atlases produced in the age of the English Empire, I also knew that England was at least the size of France and probably the same size as India. So it was quite a shock to me to look at this map. I was astonished, and the map is astonishing. It is some 4.2 metres by 2 metres in dimensions, so I have no idea what that is in your language. And it is the largest ever woodblock map printed. It's the first map in Chinese to show the Western Hemisphere at all, and it was the map that gave the Chinese knowledge of the Americas. It's the first combination of Eastern and Western cartography, and one of only a handful of examples. And it's designed by the first Westerner to penetrate mainland China. Interestingly, it's also probably, this is an arguable point, the first overtly political map in its creation. And it's the first map where the aim was not science, but the aim was persuasion. And the map is an ambassador for Western Europe to China, an ambassador for the Jesuit order, but it's also an encyclopedia and a work of art rolled into one. And in this example, as it's on 6 screens that were often rolled, that could be literally as well as figuratively. It is quite simply one of the most important cartographic documents ever put together. After my visit to the RGS, I actually had a dream about the map, one of very few I remember in my life. In the dream, I imagined one day finding an example of it. Now, my dream, I was more of an Indiana Jones character finding it than bidding on a telephone from a comfy office in Mayfair. But it is lovely to be here to actually see a 20-year-old dream come true. And in talking about the map today, I want to tell you a little bit, first of all, about Ricci's life and how the production of the map came about, and a little bit about the projection, because that, of course, is the sort of important fact about the map on first glance. And then I want to give you, and time allowing, a whirlwind-guided tour to the map, hopefully pointing out some interesting features in the geography, but also what some of those baffling text panels and illustrations around the sides mean. And then I'll finish with a little bit of the story of its acquisition and a story of this particular example. And hopefully ending with an answer to the question is, have I sold the James Ford Bell Library a fake? I think I've woken up the front row at least in that one. But before I do any of that, I want you to play a little game with me, which is when I was, not long before I went to the Royal Geographic Society to see this, I had a teacher called Mrs. Poole, who for introductory history classes made us all play a game. And I'm not going to make you actually write this down, but she gave everybody a small piece of paper and asked them to just jot down what the weather was like that day. And so, just while I'm giving the talk, play a little memory game with yourselves and think about what the weather was like when you walked in this morning. And Ricci would approve of such things. He was a great fan of memory games, and one of his great skills and one of the things that endeared him to a lot of the people when he first went in China was his ability to memorize vast passages of text almost instantaneously. I wish I could do the same. Unfortunately, I have to deal with some notes. Anyway, to start the talk, I'll tell you a little bit about Ricci's life. Born in Macerata in central Italy in 1552, he was one of 12 children. His parents were, after all, Catholic. And Macerata at that time was not a particularly pleasant place. They're famous for feuds and caught between various wars. He was relatively wealthy and came from a decent family and got a decent education in Jesuit school. His father was a pharmacist, and shortly after completing his primary education, he went on to Rome to study law. Ricci was obviously a very moral child and was not enamoured by Rome, and whilst there decided that everything was a little bit too corrupt, and what he actually did was he had a calling to religion, and he switched from law to study in St. Andrew's Quirinale in Rome as a novice with the Jesuit order. His father was furious, and in fact set off from Macerata to Rome to persuade his son to go back and earn himself a decent living. But the story Ricci tells, and he tells a lot of stories, he's written some 250,000 words that are recorded and are still held in the Vatican, is that his father encountered a horrendous storm on the way, and a wheel broke on the wagon, and he decided that this was God's way of telling him that his son really did have a calling. And so, left to his own devices, Ricci, with a bit of wanderlust, first of all stayed in Rome and studied there, and then entered a Jesuit college in Florence before going back to Rome, and then on to Spain, and finally in Portugal, where he took the first 3 vows of the Jesuit order and had an audience with King Sebastian before setting off on the 4th. The vows of the Jesuit order, as I'm sure you all know, are poverty, chastity, and obedience. The 4th is a commitment to the mission. And in doing so, he swore away his life to travel wherever the church would send him. And in his case, that was to, about as far as it could go, the Far East Asian Jesuit mission. And he left on a boat called St. Louis in March in 1578 for Goa. It's difficult for us today to imagine what it's like for a young man to leave comfortable Europe and set off on a voyage to the other side of the world. The fatality rate was something like 30% on these voyages. And he knew that the likelihood of him coming home was very low indeed, because once there, he was committed to a life working for the Jesuit mission. When he got to Goa, he studied and completed some of his studies and taught the classics, both Latin and Greek. And when there, he met with, or went out with one of them, but various other Jesuits who were to go on to play an important part in the early development of the Jesuit mission in Macau and in China. They were headed by a man called Alessandro Vanigliano, who was the brainchild of the mission in the Far East. He was somewhat older than Ricci and was a great believer in the doctrine of adaptationism, which meant that he thought that the Jesuit church, as well as having an evangelical role, ought to first of all seek to obtain influence in countries in the Far East before becoming evangelical. This was actually quite controversial because the Jesuit orders' vows of poverty would prevent them from, for example, keeping property and seeking influence with the court that's based on material gain. But Valignano wrote quite eloquently about the conflict between God and Mammon, and he determined that the Jesuit mission there, in order to begin to break this enormous cultural barrier for this totally alien part of the world, they had to impress, and they had to be seen to be knowledgeable and artistic and scientific. Valignano also was not averse from the side of Mammon, and in fact was able to fund large parts of the Jesuit mission with a series of very complicated and rather clever deals. In fact, the Jesuits ended up running the port of Nagasaki. And in doing so, were able to take taxes and got quite involved with the trade. Now, at the time, the trade between Japan and China was run pretty much by the Portuguese and the Spanish. China had an enormous silk-producing industry, and the Japanese had a relatively low appreciation of the value of silver, whereas the Chinese were much more interested. So the Jesuits did a little bit of arbitrage by taking silk from China to Japan and taking silver back over to China. And this was part of what helped to fund the initial mission. But I'm getting a bit ahead of myself, because the time in Goa was spent with a man called Michael Ruggieri, another man called Rudolfo Acquaviva, and the third called Francesco Paesio. And these 3 young Jesuits studied with Ricci while he was there and became his friends. And in fact, poor old Acquaviva, who was the son of the Duke of Atri, ended up being martyred while in there. He joked that, for all their luck, they'd end up somewhere awful like China. Lo and behold, Ruggiero first of all got the orders to move, and he set off and tried to teach himself over 3 years the Chinese language. He reported to Valignano this wasn't going well, and what they really wanted was that bright young man who could memorize everything and had a great affinity for languages. They wanted Matteo Ricci. So he was sent. In 1582, he finally left Goa, having had a brief stint in Cochin in India. and arrived in August in Macau in 1582. And the Jesuit mission that he encountered in Macau was already fairly well established, but was having enormous problems in penetrating mainland China. They could get to Canton 3 times a year for the factory season when goods were traded between the East and the West. But Francis Xavier, the founder of the Jesuit mission in China, had actually failed to make any impression into the mainland. And so it was not an optimistic place, although it was a relatively large mission. Also, the Jesuits encountered problems, and when they first were able to make a residence in Macau, they became associated with alchemy because their interest in silver trade and their apparent ability to raise money, despite having a vow of chastity, led a lot of people to conclude that, in fact, they were just making the silver using strange, nefarious, dark magic means, which made them particularly unpopular. There are also problems with land ownership. It was forbidden in China to own property, and in order to establish a mission, it was self-evident that the Jesuits would need to have some property. However, they did take with them a few interesting articles that enabled them to gain favor with some of the rather more senior mandarins operating just around Macau and Canton. And I'll just take you back in a moment to that list, but I'll just show you what these were. Some of the things that impressed were clocks, prisms, and paintings showing perspective, all 3 of which were relatively alien to the Chinese. The Chinese had problems in getting clocks that would regulate themselves, and they were very impressed by the accuracy of the Western clocks. There was no paper, there was no glass in China at the time. They used paper for their windows, and had never established, despite having a printing press for some 900 years, had never established glass manufacture. Therefore, the only thing they knew that would refract light in a way that a prism does was a diamond, and therefore they attached enormous value to these prisms. And they also, their artistic style had not yet developed linear perspective. And I put a Massacho up there, which is an unlikely thing for them to have been taking out to Macau, but it was because he was the inventor of perspective. Interesting, I was wondering while I was doing research for this map, how on earth they came to buy so many prisms. It seems an unlikely thing to take out with you. And reading around the subject a bit further, I discovered that in the 16th century, rather than taking candles down on below decks on a ship, which of course had its obvious hazards, boats would be built with prisms in the decking that would refract light and allow sailors to see when below decks. And of course that was the ready source of their prisms. And I can't begin to tell you how hard it was to find a photograph of one of those prisms. Anyway, moving back to the story. While in Macau, with these goods, he was able to impress the governor, Wang Pan, who allowed, having found a loophole in the Chinese laws, allowed the Jesuits, Matteo Ricci and Matteo Ricci, to build a settlement in Zhaoqing. And he found that it was absolutely fine, they could build a settlement. However, the law said, and I'll quote from it, that a foreigner may remain in the Middle Kingdom, providing he is quiet, humble, useful to his country, to the country. He must take from his belongings sufficient money to lead out his life, and he may be assigned land for his lodgings. But he can only stay if he cannot and does not wish to return. Obviously, that's quite a thing to promise. But having already sworn his loyalty to the church, Ricci and Ruggiero decided that that was something they could abide by. And you have to remember also that the chances of actually making it back to their homeland was relatively slim. Rather interestingly, a letter, for example, and they usually send 2 examples of each letter to make sure one of them got back, could take 3 to 4 years to get from Macau to Italy. And Ricci, at one point in his life, received a letter informing him of his father's death. Very upset by this, he subsequently received a letter to tell him that his father, in fact, wasn't dead. But he never got that letter because by the time that had got there, Ricci himself had died. While in Zhaoqing, Ricci and the Jesuits dressed and made a major error. They dressed as Buddhist bonzes, thinking that these were the holy men. However, they wanted to disassociate themselves with some of the trappings of Buddhism, in particularly idolatry. And it was a decision later on in the mission that enabled it to make more success, which was to drop the Buddhist bonzes. Because after all, the Zen Buddhists at the times carried beads, burned candles, spoke of heaven and hell, and venerated a female. So these practices made them look like Buddhists. It's rather difficult to impress upon a whole new religion if you're in fact already associated with one that's very well installed in the place. And the other thing that Ricci brought with him, as well as these gifts, was a map of the world. Now, it's not entirely clear which map was the one that the Chinese were so impressed by. But whatever happened, unauthorized copies were made of this map. And it reached far and wide into China. I suspect, and there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest this, that it was not a map on the classic Ricci projection. It was, in fact, more likely a direct copy of, his first map was a direct copy of one of the books that he took with him. But that map enabled him to break down the initial reluctance to accept Westerners and made him a lot of friends in the intellectual circles. However, there were people who were not so enamored with the Jesuits, and finally they were actually expelled in 1589 from Zhaoqing when their friendly local viceroy changed over in the normal cycle, and a Mandarin called Li Chuchai, apologize for the pronunciation, decided that actually what he wanted was the tower that they'd built as his new monument to his own greatness. So they were thrown out and given a small compensation. However, Ricci, mostly out of pride, but also with a little bit of calculation, refused to accept the compensation that was offered to them, which was shaming and embarrassing for the Mandarin. And so despite having been expelled from Zhaoqing, they were granted a visa or a passport to stay in mainland China, and they then settled in Shaozu. In Shaozu, Ricci began his translation of the four books, that's the Confucian four books, and made great headway with meeting various intellectuals who were curious as to what the Jesuit mission was about. But again, they still encountered some resistance, and the Jesuit mission was in fact attacked in the July of 1592, so much so that Ricci had to jump from the roof and forever afterwards walk with a limp in order to escape pursuing anti-Jesuit crowds. However, stories of his great feats of memory had spread, along with this story of this amazing world map he had and the other trinkets that he brought with him. And a rather senior Mandarin, the vice president of the Ministry of War, who had a not particularly smart young son who kept failing his exams, thought these great memory tricks could be used to help his son go through the examination system. And therefore, it was with this that Ricci was offered a teaching job. The vice president of the Ministry of War was on a travelling barge at the time, and so Ricci seized the opportunity to head further north in the country and head towards Beijing, which was his ultimate goal. Unfortunately, the barge actually, before it got very far down the river, was shipwrecked, drowning one of Ricci's comrades, a man called Zhao Baradas, who Ricci was awfully fond of, and it haunted him quite a lot afterwards, and he wrote quite a lot about how guilty he felt and how much he mourned the death of Baradas. But it did get him to Nanchang, and within sight of Beijing, if not literally, then at least there was a journey that he could believe making. Here he wrote his treatise on friendship and a treatise on the mnemonic arts. And you'll notice that the early books of Ricci had nothing to do with religion at all. And what he was doing was, again, the Jesuit mission of educating and informing and trying to gain influence, which goes back to Valignano's adaptationism. However, despite being named superior of the China mission and starting on a trip to Beijing and actually moving to Beijing, he was encountered a slightly manipulative eunuch by the name of Ma Tung, who basically created a case to have him expelled. And he was sent away. And in 1598, he sent back a very dejected letter, saying that it remains hard for us to believe how such a huge kingdom with so many soldiers could live in continual fear of the other states that are so much smaller, and that they fear some great disaster every year and spare no pains to protect themselves from their neighbours, either with troops or deceit or feigned friendship. He went back to Nanjing, where he was allowed to settle by Ma Tang, but in 1601, news of his map, and again other of his great powers, had made its way to the emperor. and he was invited back to Beijing. In 1601, residence was granted, and in 1602, having met various intellectuals who showed great curiosity and investigated the veracity of a lot of the scientific details in the map, he was asked and encouraged to produce a grander, so-called portable version of the map. In 1602, the six-panelled wall map was produced. In fact, to call it Ricci's map is a little bit unfair. Li Zhaozu, who was but became Li Paul, one of Ricci's early converts, was in fact the main instigator of the map. And he did a lot of the translation work, and the map was woodcut by a man called Wen Tao. Part woodcut by a man called Wen Tao. And so it is in fact a collaborative effort. And I suspect that Ricci was more involved in a consultative fashion than he was in a strict authorship. But that map, along with his increasing reverence or increasing interest in his ideas, gained him great notoriety and fame. And he was able to finally, in 1603, publish his first book that was overtly religious, The True Meaning of the Lord of Heaven, which was an attempt to reconcile some aspects of Confucianism with the Christian religion. And also, by 1607, he translated the first 6 books of Euclid, but by then he was becoming a relatively old man, certainly in 17th century terms. In 1608, aware of his mortality, he wrote the story of the Jesuit mission in China, which was actually left in manuscript until last century. And in doing so, was able to preserve some of the tales that I'm now able to tell you. He was happy in his time in Beijing. In fact, a man called Shen Defu wrote in a book that Ricci ate and drank exuberantly. After one particularly heavy night, Ricci returned exhausted and tired, and told one of his colleagues that he was not feeling good and he was not long for this earth. Told he would get better soon, he replied, "Far from it. This illness is caused by having far too much to do, and it will prove fatal." In 1610, 400 years ago, Ricci passed away, leaving us amongst, as I say, 250,000 words, astonishing cartographic heritage. And it's now I would like to turn to actual discussion of the map itself. This talk from now on will be very heavily illustrated, because for me, talking about maps without being able to handle them and look at the material is a little bit like cooking without salt. You're unable to establish the flavour of any of the concepts, and you can't see the mapmaker's art unless it's up there in front of you. So if you bear with me while I flick through a rather long slideshow. Well, what can we see from the map? The most important thing setting about any world map is to establish its projection. And this one is a new projection. But sometimes what we can't see is as interesting as what we can. If you look at many medieval or later maps produced in Western Europe, they tend to be adorned with many galleons and many animals. Neither of these is present on this carnation of the map. And also, there are no religious references on this map. There are no vignettes showing Jesus on the cross. That's because, very wisely, and unsure of the religious preferences of the country in which he'd moved, Ricci stripped away threats of galleons and ships that might be invading China, stripped away animals, the representation of which might offend, and took away any reference to religion, lest they fear his evangelism. We know that Ricci took certain things with him. And in establishing the projection of the map, we know that he used the books that he had. In fact, the map is largely derivative. There are various choices a mapmaker can make when trying to convey a spherical world on a flat plane. This is the classic Ptolemaic map projection of the world. This is from the Ulm edition of 1482, which was a book we know from Ricci's records he had with him. And this shows a world without the Americas. And this was the main type of atlas produced before 1506, or thereabouts, showing the Americas. And we know that he had that map with him. That's one choice of projection. From the Ptolemaic style of atlases, the cordiform map projections developed. These have a great symbolic appeal, especially for a Catholic order. But he chose not to use one of those. There are also, this is just for sake of illustration, a vast variety of ways. This is what's called an equatorial orthographic projection, and one that's perhaps more familiar to you, the twin hemispheres, this being one from Gerard Mercator's son, Ronald Mercator. Again, we know that Ricci took some Mercator maps with him. Although Mercator's atlas not being published in full till 1595, it is unlikely he was able to take that with him in 1582. He did, however, have Ortelius's 1570 atlas. This is the first printed atlas. And you can see that this is the one that influenced his map the most. And I suspect this is the map that was copied for his first map in 1584, no example of which survives. And there's a Nanjing example mentioned in the literature from 1599, incomplete, which is probably a version of this. For the 1602 map, Ricci took this base and he spun it through 170 degrees to put China at the center of the map. But in 1592, probably more like 1594 when he got it, he was presented with the Plancius world map. And it's this map, which you can see, is actually the most influential on the cartography, if not the projection. If you compare the Ricci map there, have a look at the shape of South America in that example. It has no bulge out on the far west. The same is true, to a certain extent, of the Plancius map. But if you go back to the Ortelius, you can see a very different shape. Oops, excuse me, gone one too far. Also on this map, you can see the large southern continent, Magellanica, which the theory supposed would have to be there, because otherwise, with all this stuff up north, the world would tip over. Again, you can see Magellanica appearing in the Plancius world map. And what I'm now going to do is try and take you on a little tour of some of the periphery components of the map. These are the so-called prefaces, the large text blocks, as well as the illustrations. And the first preface, the very, very large one over there, is by Matteo Ricci himself. And he starts by reconciling, the diplomat as ever, the Confucian view of the world, which is to say that the world is square and the heavens are round, by saying that really, actually, an egg is a better analogy, which is that the yolk is surrounded by the albumin, and of course the egg appealing very much to the Confucian notions. And so he then, from doing this, goes on to say that he has also traveled pretty much all the way around the world, and in doing so, he's seen that where days and nights are equal, and that there is, north of the equator, the time zones, the effect of length of days and nights are the same as the same distance south of the equator, therefore confirming that the world may be round. He also, in that preface, interestingly, mentions that the continents on the map ought to be coloured. Interestingly, none of the early examples of the map seems to have colour, or much original colour anyway, if any. And he also says that the continent names should be in red. Then, going on to my little diagram there, we can see the next, working from right to left, because of course it is a Chinese map after all, the next text block up there, B, is a description of his map of the 9 celestial levels. And this is a map that shows, as you can see, the different planets that were known to them at the time, Venus and Mercury, all of which, of course, circling the Earth. Of course, Copernican theory was around in 1602, but probably hadn't made it to China. And he does adhere to a Ptolemaic view of the Earth being in the center of the universe and the heavens rotating around. And then at C, there's a description of the 4 elements, followed by the diagram itself that I've just shown you. Letter E is a note on the changing length of days and nights. And then down at the bottom here, F is a description of the diagram G. Let's go like that. Which is an armillary sphere showing how the heavens rotate around the Earth. And this is, in fact, a diagram that was meant to be made into an instrument. Ricci condoned the development of encouraged the development of an instrument as part of the educational program of the map. And then down here at F, at H, there is a very long mathematical note about how to calculate the length of a degree, because obviously on a spherical globe, the length of a degree going from north to south is naturally longer going from east to west, rather. It naturally gets shorter towards the poles as a segment, like if you imagine it like an orange, on the lines of longitude. And then, then we have a series of prefaces done by eminent scholars in the time, attesting to Ricci's credentials. And interestingly, the first one here at I is one by a man called Wu Zongming, and he refers to Ricci as Li Shanren. Now, Shanren is a Chinese scholar who has attained such a level of knowledge that he can leave the city and go and live in the hills as a hermit. So it's a great accolade indeed. And then at J, the main preface, sitting in the middle of the Pacific, is by Li Zhizhao, Li Paul, his first convert, where he says the main key to the map that was astonishing to the Chinese, which is that you can use astronomy to accurately fix the degrees on a map. And that this map is the first map they'd ever seen that did that. Other prefaces follow at K, L, and M in various degrees, also attesting to Ricci's greatness and the veracity of the information to be found on the map. And then at N, here, he has a description of making a device so that you can measure the number of degrees of the pole star as an aid in navigation. So it is a real encyclopedia of Western knowledge at that time. And then, sorry, let's catch up, there we go. And then R, this is a note on the solar and lunar eclipse and proof that the, beginnings of proof that the moon is smaller than the sun. Again, information that was new to the Chinese, and one of the things that impressed them by Ricci and even some of his successors was the ability of the Jesuit scientists to determine the times of eclipses. Also on the map, that's of interest, up here, one of my favourite little details, is the production notes on the map. And there's a note there that says, this map has a measurement scale. Dear artisan, i.e. the man cutting it and putting it on the press, please do not cut off the edge of this panel. The size of the screen is designed to be this size and to fit on a screen of this size. And then at the top and bottom of the map, you'll find these two maps of the hemispheres, north and south of the equator. I apologize for the fact you can't read the text on here. These illustrations are done for a translation that we're hoping to publish at some point. And this is a polar hemisphere. It's fascinating because you can see in the middle the four magnetic islands. This is an idea taken from Mercator, which are the magnetic pole must have these magnetic mountains on it with lots of iron ore in them to attract the needle of a compass. And that's common currency in maps of this period. But what is interesting about this map is this is in fact a totally new projection to show the whole of the northern hemisphere of the globe, invented by a French mathematician called Guillaume Postel. The very first Postel map came out in about 1584, and it wasn't in a readily available printed form until 1593. This is very up-to-date information. In fact, if you look at Mercator's map of the poles, it only extends some of the way down the northern hemisphere, not the whole way. And similarly, with the south of the equator, you've got, again, this large content of Magellanica here, but still going all the way through to the equator from the pole. And that's the first example in 1593 of the Postel projection in any regularly available atlas. That's Gerard Diode's great atlas, one of my favorite maps, as it happens. Going back to the rather small details on the text blocks, we also have at Y a diagram here for how the seasons are affected by the distance between the particular place on Earth and the sun. And interestingly, he has Beijing as the center of the Earth there. You'll note the 40 degrees above land, making sure that China, which was of course called the Middle Kingdom, was in the center of the diagram. And also at Z, which I missed, pardon me, there are the printing notes, which says that the map was printed by Zhang Wentao of Quintang in the first month of autumn in Renyin, which is year 1602, in the era of Wanli, the emperor. We'll come back to that idea a little bit later. Now, what's interesting about that is that's all very baldly scientific. That's information that's meant to impress. What's meant to happen on the interior of the map, however, is to display not just knowledge of the whole of the world, but to amaze. And Ricci takes a very, very odd selection of details from each of the continents and information about local customs, natural history, and the geography. And these are not necessarily the most based in the most science. I'm just going to take you on a little tour around the world here of some of the more amusing ones. First slide, because we're going from west to east, not because of any preference for my audience, is of course North America. And here they say that the people are good and pure, and when foreigners come, they're well treated. Well, I can certainly testify to that part. They also say that people in the mountains kill each other, flight and plunder throughout the year, and all they eat are snakes, ants, spiders, and other bugs. An interesting feature of this bit of the map is this is long before any of the exploration of Hudson Bay. But in that river, in that lake feature there, there's a little note at 3, and it says here that this lake is great and fresh, and its limits have not been explored. But from here, a boat can take you to the country of Saguenay, which is not that untrue. It's obviously some knowledge of the Great Lakes. So perhaps some exploration had actually been done there before some of the voyages that I'm sure you're all familiar with. It's an interesting fact of the map, something perhaps might need some more research. Next slide shows the other side of North America. Now, here you can see a very interesting semi-Alaska. And it does say, one of the notes, that this used to be connected to mainland Asia, but is no longer. Also, on this map is a lovely note about the animals that can be found there, including cows that have saddle-shaped flesh on their backs like camels. Of course, a reference to bison. In Central America, Guatemala and Yucatan are perhaps familiar to us. An interesting Florida, it says, means land of flowers. There's a lovely reference to Dog River north of New York, which comes from a mispronunciation of essentially Bitch River in Derek Demaine's book on the subject, and that appears in the Ricci map, which is quite amusing. Mexico, there it mentions that it produces birds of all coloured feathers and that people wear feather clothes. Interestingly, this is sympathetic to the Chinese tendencies. The Chinese were very impressed by Western plumes and their ability to write, and Ricci actually wrote a letter suggesting that the Pope might arrange to export an ostrich to give to the emperor as a present. And so here he's appealing to some of the sentiments of the Chinese, and they're very interested in feathers. And feathers are a recurring theme on this map, as you'll see. And off the coast of California, which he calls the American Red Sea, there is the great preface of Lee Paul. And he says a wonderful appeal to the reader. No matter whether we're Easterners or Westerners, our hearts and logic are the same. Is it not right to believe this? The world is great and thick, but this map is made of paper and ink. So in a moment you can cross 10,000 miles, and the 8 expanses become like a toy ball. That sums up pretty much the experience of looking at the map, and certainly was a good appeal to the readers at the time. In North and South America, there's a mention of the balsam tree, which of course also he mentions is to be found in Judea, again trying to bring together bits of geography. And in South America, he has various cognates that we'll find familiar again. Polu for Peru, Chile for Chile, and Patuan for Patagonia. In Patagonia, either side of this river, he mentions at 21, this is the land of giants, some of only 10 foot tall. And at 22, he says this is the land of dwarves. Also of interest here, he mentions the silver mines in Peru. And the Jesuits at the time were very seriously involved with the silver mining. And one of the reasons that Ricci, amongst others, were thought of as alchemists was because they were buying vast amounts of mercury in Canton. This is because amalgamation was invented in 1572. And as the decreasing rich veins of silver in the mines in Potosi became harder and harder to reach, they were using mercury for amalgamation. But, of course, the Chinese didn't realize this. They thought they were turning the mercury into silver. And that is one of the reasons why they were subjected to so much persecution for being alchemists. In Brazil, there's a mention of cannibals who only eat male meat, not female. And also a lovely reference to people who have beds and bedding made out of string, an early reference to a hammock. And there's a lovely description a bit further south than here, in Patagonia, of people who don't manage with writing, but communicate with a kind of, I suppose, Morse code with knots in string. And in Brazil, he also mentions an animal with the top half of which is like a cat and the bottom half like a monkey, with human feet and owl ears. The skin on its stomach can expand and contract to accommodate its children. Possibly the most poetic description of an opossum ever written. He also mentions the hai, or perhaps we know it now more likely as a hai, the ai, which does not eat or drink and lives on air. This is because the ai has the habit of turning its head towards the air in order to smell the breeze. And so they thought that it was eating the air, and that was how it was living. Now we move from the Americas, go back a minute. Move from the Americas. I just want to put the world map back up to locate you. We're going to cross the Pacific and go up to one of the most fascinating bits of the map, which is northern Tartary and this island here. This is where Ricci, for the first time, introduces totally new cartography in the form of Chinese cartography on the map. And here he mentions the Arctic islands in the north of Tartary, where it is half the year it has sunlight and half the year it's black, a concept we're familiar with. But also he says that there are people in a place called Kudumai, which is taken across from the Chinese to represent the part of Tartary where people are very tall but their clothes are short and they only have pigs and no other livestock. Also, just further along from that last map, there are mentions of the ghost land in North Tartary, where people, eyes, and noses, and faces are on the tops of their heads, with mouths on in the normal place, with mouths on the tops of their heads. And also a mention of tribe where the children will eat their parents when they get too old, rather than leave them to die in the frozen wastelands. This again taken from Wenxiang Tongkao, a contemporary Chinese source. Ricci's description of Japan is incredibly accurate, but interestingly, a very Western depiction of Japan, because Japan and China weren't on exactly speaking terms for most of history. And at this period, the Western maps of Japan, which are extraordinarily accurate because the Jesuit mission was rather well established there by then, show a large number of place names and Japan correctly depicted as 4 islands, if on a slightly skewed perspective. And Korea is also named and mentioned on the map, saying that it is, of course, part of China. China itself is given very scant treatment. It says overtly that place names cannot be done in detail, only the places where the sun's shadow was measured, which of course was his scientific measurements, are recorded. An interesting feature, as you can see up there, is the Great Wall. And something I'll come back to a bit later on. There's you can't see it so well because I've bleached back some of the background here to show the map in contrast. But there is, by Beijing, a characteristic "you are here" prod mark. Moving further south, we get to Indonesia and the Moluccas, where he mentions, again coming back to our theme of feathers, a very large bird called the emu. It has wings but cannot fly. Actually, he means the cassowary. It's a lovely, friendly-looking chap. And also in Indonesia, there's mention of the ancient island of Taprobana and a dragon. Now, presumably this is the well-known Komodo dragon, where he says people shoot them regularly, a reference to the Westerners rather than the local inhabitants. And Taprobana is a mythical island that at some point in Western maps is Ceylon, and then gradually moves further and further south to become Sumatra. South of here is one of the most fascinating bits of the map, and personally for me, amazing. This here is a very, very close representation of the Gulf of Carpentaria. This is Papua New Guinea. Well, New Guinea. He's got a little bit of confusion about what's going on there. And there is a reference to someone from Castile, a Spanish explorer perhaps, setting foot in Australia. One of the areas of the map that requires more research is to find out what that could possibly be about. Certainly there was no record at this point of any Westerner setting foot in Australia and mapping it, which is what we have here. Magellanica, by the way, is named after the parrots that were found there. And so the whole of the southern continent became called Magellanica after the parrots. Well, obviously after Magellan, but they had a name after parrots in the Chinese. In India, with which Ricci was deeply familiar, of course, he says there's nothing that cannot be found here. Gold, diamonds, jewellery, spices. And also mentions an animal called the gemeliang, which is the chameleon. And then moving on to Arabia. I mentioned earlier that the whole map is essentially derivative on previous cartographic representations. There is one area where I have not been able to find any example of a map with this particular cartography, and that is Arabia. This strange anvil-shaped Arabia doesn't appear on any Western map that I know of, and one can only assume at the moment that perhaps this has some Chinese origin, and certainly it's different from other contemporary maps, such as the Plancius, which we saw earlier. Interestingly, also in Arabia, there's a reference to the Dead Sea and where things can float on it as well. This, as you can possibly tell, is the Holy Land, and here's Egypt and the Red Sea, Gulf of Arabia. On many examples of the surviving of the Ricci map, a reference here has been taken out, which was, this is the location of where the Lord of Heaven was born, i.e. Jesus Christ. And for later, particularly Japanese incarnations of the map, any reference to Christianity was removed. But on this example, it stays. Now back home, which reminds me, has anyone got the score? In Europe, which is bizarre given that Ricci comes from here, is given possibly the worst cartographic treatment. It's incredibly crude. He mentions that in England there are no snakes or spiders, possibly confusing information about Ireland. And this large text block here at 91 mentions that there are over 30 countries all employing a monarchical government system. And there's only rule that is followed is the holy religion of God, and the Lord of Heaven is worshipped. He also mentions there are only 3 classes of individuals, because of course the class system was very well established in China, the highest class of which are the religious people. Not a surprise. He also says there's nothing not known in astronomy and logic, and the customs strongly emphasize the 5 relationships, again a reference to Confucianism, trying to tie in his cultural background with the background of the people who the audience for the map. He also says that in ancient times, people did not travel to China, which is 80,000 miles away. But in the past 70-odd years, communication has been established, again giving us some idea of the background date for the cartography of this map. Presumably, he's referring to early 17th century journeys to China. Also in Europe is something that fascinates me personally, and here I'm going to delve off into a bit of conjecture. The country that has the worst cartographic depiction above all others is Italy. Well, that's his homeland. Now, why would that be? And interestingly, the model for Italy on this map is not that dissimilar from the 1482 Ptolemy that he took with him. Another fascinating thing is the Ricci projection that he chose, the oval projection after Ortelius, has a very interesting effect. It stretches out the east-west dimension enormously. Now, you already heard how Ricci was depressed by how scared of invasion this enormous nation of China was. I think that it's quite likely that in order to reassure his audience, he put Europe as far away as he possibly could. He also made Europe seem, almost unobtainable distance in terms of their own sphere of reference. But in doing so, didn't want to give too much away about home. And so Italy remains remarkably naive on the map. There is a reference here, which is also, again, often scored out in other examples of the map that are known, to the Pope, who lives in Rome and is the only person, rather controversially from a Chinese point of view, able to speak to the Lord of Heaven. Moving south, if my computer will catch up with me, we get to Egypt, where he recognizes the Nile as the longest river in the world, and calls Africa Libya, which is the name given just there in the open-lettered text. That, of course, was meant to be coloured red in the map, according to his earlier mention. And there's a lovely reference also to the muskrat and the musk, and not muskrat, the cats, where they take musk in Egypt by scraping the neck of the map with a stone and use it for European perfume. Running south from there, we have, off the tip of South Africa, by the way, there's a mention of crocodile fish, which I suspect is a reference to shark. And just slightly further north, in this area here of modern Zimbabwe, monumental, he has a reference to a beast with a head like a horse, With a horn in its forehead, its hide is extremely thick. All over its body are scales. Its feet and tail are like an ox. It is thought to be a quillin. The Chinese were perhaps as familiar with a rhinoceros from their trading with India as Westerners. And in fact, this is Albrecht Dürer's famous engraving of the rhino from 1515, and they were still being toured around Europe as an exotic beast and a unicorn. In fact, on the map that Ricci based most of his map on, you will see just up here, a rhinoceros appears along with a crocodile or a Komodo dragon. It's not too clear which. So you can see the origins of a lot of the stories that are told in the map coming from this map alone. So now I turn from the general to the specific. Ricci's map, as is the JFB or the James Ford Bell example. James Ford Bell example of the map is, like all the others known, a 32 woodblock engraving on six panels. Interestingly, while we've been doing some of the work on this map, and to make those illustrations that you just saw, I've stripped away a lot of the over-inking on the map and the general junk. And in doing so, was able to see the grain of the wood that was used in the wood blocks. So we can tell you that it's probably pear wood. And we can also tell you that it's probably long grain pear wood used to engrave the map, because usually woodcutters, especially European woodcutters, would use the end of a piece of wood to get the harder, more wearing grain, whereas the Chinese were perhaps more used to using the long grain. And of course, with the scale of the with the scale of the map, it'd be rather difficult to get the enormous panels out of the end of a piece of pear wood, because pears tend not to grow that wide. In doing so, I also, I've been able to see some specific features of this map that come on to answer the question, have I sold the James Ford Bell Library a fake? Well, it's interesting. The first thing you need to know about this map is that there are erasures of Jesuit symbols which would have been printed on there. Now, this is not uncommon. Any map that spent any length of time in Japan would have had this done to it. Any map that spent time in China would have probably been destroyed. Whereas the Japanese, quite happy to have the map, but just didn't want any Jesuit symbols on them. But interestingly, on this, there are other erasures, somewhat confusing. It's rather difficult to see up here, so I won't bother trying to point them out. But when you go and have a look at the map later, you can see at various areas of the map there are bits of over-inking of sea areas from where things have gone blank. There are changes to text down there, and all sorts of places in the map. There are little tiny erasures and changes. However, the printer's block, printer's colophon, sitting there, mentions that this is the original engraved in 1602. I've compared it with a couple of other examples of the map, and there seems to be substantial change in text between nearly every surviving example. But what I'm tending to think now about this one is it is in fact the missing unauthorized copy. And something else we've seen on this is that the inking on the paper seems to have been put on rather clumsily. There's a lot of over-inking, a bit of under-inking, and it would be because the paper it was used for, it was printed on when the paper was wet, was dry. Normally you print on wet paper so as to get an overall even impression the paper gets forced onto the block. Whereas if you were trying to do something quick when the boss wasn't looking, you might want to have the paper that you just stuck on one side during the working day and after hours whacked it back on the block when dry. And that would perhaps suggest what we have is the unauthorized example, no copy of which is known. Another thing about this example that's fascinating is you go back to that "you are here" mark over Beijing. You would think that if Beijing was the place people were pointing at, this map may at some point in its history have spent quite a bit of time in Beijing, and in which case would be the only one of the 6 surviving copies to have come out of China at some point. The others all were sent by the Jesuits either to Japan or back to Europe. So, coming off the specific of the James Ford Bell copy, was Ricci's mission to China, can't move on, a success? Oh, too far. There we go. Well, after his death in 1610, he was succeeded by some eminent figures in the Jesuit church and in the field of science. Both Adam Charles von Bell, who went on to bring the first telescope to China, and Ferdinand Verbiest, who, before the Jesuits were expelled, was able to build a whole, or rebuild, I should say, the Beijing Observatory and produce a great copy of Ricci's map. In terms of converts, they weren't as successful. At the height of the Jesuit mission in China, it had a few thousand, not the conversion of the Caesar that they'd hoped for to bring Christianity to the east as it had been brought to the west. With the rights controversy, where the Pope refused to allow the Jesuits to permit or to encourage Chinese ancestor worship, the Jesuit church fell out of favor both in Rome and in China. And in 1742, Pope Benedict XIV officially opposed the Jesuits and forbade all their work in China and decreed it. This decree was not repealed until 1938. And in fact, the methodology of Ricci remained suspect until the late 50s, when Pope John XXIII put an encyclical in to say that Ricci was in fact the model of missionaries. And in the last 70 years or 60 years or so, he has been reinstated as a visionary and a great ambassador for the Jesuit Church. Before I finish my talk, which I think is now running close on the time I was allotted for it, I'd like to say thank you to Ford Bell, Diane Nyman, Carol Ernest, Bill Moran, Maggie Ragnow, and everybody else who's made me extremely welcome here and helped with both the purchase of the map and the discussions surrounding today's talk and inviting me here. But before I finish, remember the little mental game from earlier from my Mrs. Poole when I was at school. She gathered in all those small pieces of paper on which we'd written the weather on that day, put them in a wastepaper basket, because in those days health and safety was such a consideration, set light to them in the middle of the classroom, and then picked up one piece of paper, which today would have read, "It's sunny outside." And the lesson from that is that history is what remains and not what disappears. And there's a serious point here, because if the Ricci map has anything to teach us today, then, yeah, sure, it tells us a great deal about graphic representation. It shows us a lot about cultural relativity and sensitivity and diplomacy and the Jesuit mission. And it even says something about the commonality of man and how, it's very relevant for the James Ford Bell Library, communication and experience can help break down barriers which trade can walk in and flourish. But above all else, there's one lesson that this does teach you, which is that you can't rely on governments, on institutions, and even really on individuals to preserve material unless we all try to preserve material. Because there were over 2,000 authorized copies of this map made. No idea how many countless of thousands unauthorized copies of this map made. And yet today, only 6 survive, and not one has survived in China. This has a contemporary relevance because, if you think it's different now, one of the problems I've encountered in putting together this translation with Vic Peterson, who I must also thank, who's done enormous amounts of work on the translation and on those diagrams, was trying to get large-sized files from China to London is not as easy as you think, because they block all sorts of FTP servers. So this is a problem for us today as it was then. And it's up to each of us to protect this heritage, which is why not only should you support institutions such as the Minnesota Institute of Arts and the James Ford Bell Library, but it's why you should also all collect maps. Today it's 400 years, 1 month, and exactly 1 day since Ricci died. And so I think it's only fair that he gets the last word. He says in the preface to the map that you see before you, "Maps and historical records are valuable. Maps recording history are passed down, and scholars from everywhere can look at them. People in the past recorded them, and later generations can look at them. And just by sitting there and looking at them, ignorance decreases and knowledge increases." Aren't the achievement of maps fantastic? Thank you.
I think we have time for 1 or 2 questions. Are there any in the audience? Yes.
Could you tell us the mystery of the actual acquisition?
Yeah, the map itself, there's a little bit of story about its actual purchase. I got a letter from Diane Nyman some 3 years ago, I think now, saying that the James Paul Bell Library were looking for one or two things, but also, in the medium term, a major acquisition. I then sold a couple of items to the library and got a letter from Diane on the day I was looking through an auction catalogue for an auction in China. The map itself was, rather sadly for the owner at the time, put into a calligraphy auction rather than a cartographic or a book auction. And as a result, fortunately for me, passed relatively unnoticed by the map trade world. That's where we bought it. I understand from the auction house it was in a private Japanese collection for some 35 years before that. But I don't know any more than that, I'm afraid. Its provenance between 1602 and about 1950 make a whole story in themselves.
There's time for one more question here. Why was it ever called the Impossible Black Tulip?
Actually, I may live to regret this. I lifted that out of a description of the map done by a man called Philip Robinson, who was a bookseller for a major London bookseller. And he acquired a huge pile of Jesuit material that, in fact, was Ferdinand Verbiest's archive when he bought from his place of employment what was called Philip's 1986, which was one of the folios from the Great Phillips collection sold in the 19th century and put together in the 19th century. And he decided to come to sell this collection, but not until he'd written a few articles on it, where obviously, with the interest of the vendor, puffed it up big. And the black tulip was a phrase that he borrowed, referring to the 17th century tulip mania and massive value attached to things. From a personal point of view, I'm a great Alexander Dumas fan, and of course it's the title of one of his books.
The James Ford Bell map is on view at the MIA until August 29th. Thank you so much, Daniel, for speaking today.